Good evening and welcome members on Refugees in America with Mariel Sanchez of the Partnership for Advancement and Immersion of Refugees, also known as PAIR Houston. I'm Jahan Jaffapour, Member Services Manager at the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Before we start, on Wednesday, August 12th, the Council is hosting Economic Advisor and former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich. The event is free for members, so sign up today to reserve your seat for next week's program at wachhouston.org. Mariel Sanchez is the Senior Program Manager at PAIR Houston, where she's responsible for the educational mentoring programs for refugee youth. She graduated at Tufts University with a master's degree in international affairs and holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Texas at Austin. Tonight's conversation with Mariel will be moderated by our Senior Education Manager, Alicia Chapman. Welcome, Mariel.
Thank you so much, Jahan, for that warm welcome. We are so excited to have Mariel Sanchez with us to talk about refugees in America, as well as refugees from our global perspective. So starting off tonight, I wanted to get your perspective on what is the overall global refugee situation and why are there so many refugees right now around the world?
Well, first, thank you to Jahan for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I love the work of the World Affairs Council, and I'm just really honored to be here and excited to hear your questions as well as your audience questions. So the situation right now is there are about 79.5 million displaced people around the world, and displaced people doesn't mean that they're all refugees. Only about 26 million of them are refugees. Most of those refugees are in places that are facing current conflicts and wars, as is the case for most refugees around the world. And the main source countries right now are Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. I mentioned 26 million are refugees. The rest of that, nearly 80 million, are internally displaced within their own countries. So they're also facing very harsh conditions, but they are not fleeing international borders. And that number also includes asylum seekers. So I think at this moment, we're in a very unique place with everything happening with COVID-19. There have been a lot of travel restrictions imposed, not just by the US, but a lot of other refugee receiving countries. So I think the current trend is that a lot of the resettlement for refugees that had been accepted to go to other countries has been halted or suspended, at least temporarily, for health conditions. So that's what we're dealing with in the world, and kind of zooming into the US specifically. As you may know, or some people may know or not, the US imposes a national ceiling for the number of refugees that can come every year. And that number of people that we allow to come as refugees has been decreasing significantly over the past 4 years since the Trump administration. So we are also seeing some new restrictions from the legal and policy end within our own country that are unfortunately not being conducive to hosting a lot of the people facing some really harsh situations around the world.
Yeah. And I know you talked about that there are the difference between displaced as well as refugees. Could you expand a little bit more on the difference between refugees and an asylum seeker? I know sometimes people might use those interchangeably, or they might, not know exactly what the two are.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important distinction to make before going deeper into this discussion, because those two groups get kind of mixed together a lot, but there are big differences both in the laws that apply as well into the services they receive and the kinds of challenges that they face inside and outside of the United States. So a refugee, as far as the definition from the U.S. perspective goes, is somebody that's already been granted asylum status. So they are accepted as refugees before they come to the U.S. That means that they apply within their asylum countries where they first flee, and they get granted the status of refugees over there, right? They go through all kinds of background checks. It takes 18 months, 2 years, or longer to get through all of the systems and checkpoints that the U.S. has in place to admit a refugee. And when they come, they're eligible for certain benefits, and they're eligible to become permanent legal residents of America and citizens down the line. Asylum seekers are facing a very different situation. So if you think about all of the people that are currently at the border waiting for entry into the United States, they are asylum seekers. So the big difference is that under international law, everybody has the right to seek asylum, right? You can go to Canada tomorrow and say, I'm scared of being in my country. Can you let me in? But the decision whether to let you in or not and allow you to become a refugee, that depends on that particular country. So I think one of the big issues right now that we're seeing is that by grouping refugees and asylum seekers together, we're not doing a favor to either. We're calling refugees a lot of the people at the border that have not been granted that status and are just waiting to hear on their cases or even get the opportunity to present a case before our immigration systems. So they have not been granted any kind of legal protection just yet. Whereas refugees, they've already gone through more interviews than you can imagine, medical screenings and other things, and they've been approved to come with already that protection and that legal status. But with COVID, I think just it's the travel that's kind of the barrier at this moment in time. But yeah, that's kind of the big difference. Everybody has a right to apply, not everybody has the right to get it. Refugees have already been granted legal status, whereas asylum seekers haven't yet.
Thank you so much for that distinction. I think oftentimes people misplace or misuse those words interchangeably. And so I know prior to your work with Pair Houston, you had the opportunity to be on the legal side of immigration and refugee. So what did you learn about the legal and the policy side, and how are these policies affecting us now and affecting the refugees being treated during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think one of the main things I've learned, both through my personal experience navigating our immigration system, as well as all the cases I saw working on the legal side, is that our immigration system is very complex and restrictive. It's really designed more so to limit who comes and who stays rather than inviting the people that would make our country better. And so I would say for people that are not familiar with immigration law, there are three core categories of immigration, right? So you have employment-based. My knowledge of employment-based is very limited because most of my experience has been with the other two categories. The second is family-based. So if you have a close relative or somebody who can sponsor you to come to the country, that's your other way to get some kind of legal status here. And the third is what I put under the big umbrella of humanitarian cases. So your asylum seekers, your refugees, your victims of crime, human trafficking. And then we have this section of just immigrant categories that are under some kind of temporary status. So your deferred action for childhood arrivals, which are a big part of the immigration conversation right now, your TPS people, and then we have people that we gave a special status just out of moral obligations or political obligations. So we have special immigrant visas for people from Iraq, Afghanistan. In the past, we gave those types of statuses to people from Vietnam and Cuba, just based on kind of our political involvement or the wars that we've had in those countries. So if you don't fall neatly into those categories, there's really very little chance that you can ever migrate here. And even within the laws that exist for those core categories, there's this problem not just of what is available under the law, but how do those laws get implemented, right? So what that means is kind of zooming into the asylum and refugee law. For you to become a refugee, you have to show that you have a fear of persecution or you've been persecuted. But you will only qualify if that persecution happens because of your race, your nationality, your political opinion, your religion, or your membership in a social group. So that leaves a lot of the people that are fleeing very critical and insecure conditions out, right? Because what about all the people fleeing criminal and gang activity in Central America? What about people in Africa that are being displaced and facing threats to their livelihoods because of climate change? They don't fall neatly into those categories. So out of a humanitarian duty, I would argue there should be some path for them to find safety, but that really doesn't exist right now. So I think that's one of the things. And then when it comes to asylum, the laws from kind of the international conventions don't really tell countries how to apply those laws. So you have this law that exists and say anybody who's fleeing persecution or has a fear of it should be allowed to go somewhere else for safety. But there's no guidance telling the US, this is how you process somebody applying for asylum, or this is how you admit a refugee into your country. So what you see right now, right, is that you don't have there's this lag in our court system. There's this incredibly complex process to apply for anything or any kind of immigration relief, because there's a problem of kind of operationalizing all of those laws and policies that get put into place. So it's kind of ineffective, but at the same time, it does, I think, at least up until some years, we did have the opportunity to offer people that really, really deserved relief that we are in a place to offer, because America has a lot of need for immigration, and there is also just an incredible wealth of experiences that come with the people who are foreign born and come to this country.
Yeah, thank you. And kind of moving and switching gears into looking more locally, what is our current situation and status of the refugees that are here in the Texas and Houston area? I know prior to that, Texas kind of put a limit on how many refugees they will allow in. And so what has that impact from Governor Abbott's decision in January to stop Texas taking in and receiving any more refugees? What has happened, and what do you think the foreseeable future will be the results of such a diverse city like Houston?
Yeah, I think all of those announcements have been just very disappointing. Houston has a history and a reputation of being an incredibly welcoming city to both immigrants and refugees. The majority of all the people that resettle in the U.S. as refugees get placed in Texas. We have the resources, right? We have some of those pull factors as far as having low cost of living and jobs available to them, and a great medical center to serve the people that have a lot of vulnerability. So I think in the past, we always prided ourselves on being the city that welcomed the most refugees out of everybody in the U.S. I think that has changed, and I think it's really sad that just our state government is not seeing that, even if at the local level we do want to open our doors to more people coming from outside, especially people that don't have a choice in where they go. So there are kind of two parts to that. In 2016, Governor Abbott made this announcement, which again was more of a political move as far as, oh yeah, Texas is withdrawing from the resettlement program. All that did really was transition the leadership in terms of administering the federal funding to a local organization. So refugees have kept coming since that announcement was made. The one that was made more recently is a little bit more concerning because it's just following suit to this executive action from Trump, just saying that states have the right to not place refugees in their communities if they don't want them. So I don't know exactly. I think the resettlement program is already suffering a lot by nature of the national ceiling, right? So the average of people that were approved for refugee resettlement up until 2016-17 was around 80,000. So those were the numbers of refugees coming year to year. Trump brought that cap down to 45,000, and then in 2019 to 30,000. And the most refugees we can accept as a country right now are 18,000. So what that means is that it's not just that people won't be coming to Houston because of the announcement from our governor. It's just that refugees are not coming at all, or they're coming in very low numbers as compared to previous years. So I think that's really concerning. And one of the things that a lot of people don't consider is that setting those limits, it's not just affecting the new refugee arrivals or the refugees who are here, but there is an entire ecosystem of service providers and private sector companies and other people that employ refugees, that support refugees, that have talent and skill. And I think a lot of those organizations are suffering now because if you don't have a lot of refugee clients to serve or people to hire, what are you going to do? So I think it's a matter of thinking a little bit beyond just, oh, we don't want refugees for whatever reason. And I think one of the other justifications that have been used in the last few years is this idea of national security and border security, and that's why we don't let people in. But the reality is not that way. I think if you look at just data, it's really unfounded that refugees are tied with terrorism or anything like that. That hasn't really been seen. So I think it's mostly just a lot of negative rhetoric and people that are just words that politicians use to get people to think certain things are happening. But I think it's just a very sad situation, because these are people that are not here by choice. Right? Nobody wants to leave their home because there's a war outside, or because they're being constantly attacked based on who they are.
Yeah. And based on your work in the legal sector with refugees and immigration, what's the process like for those who, in 2016 and then 2019, because of the regulations, what happens to the families where they were in the process? They were in the process for it, but at this time they weren't necessarily being able to be with their families because of the recent regulations.
Yeah, a lot of waiting, right? So there are people who sadly, you apply for refugee status. First, you have to prove to the United Nations that you have a valid case to be a refugee in the country that you first go to. It's not like most refugees are coming here, because they're fleeing Syria directly. They usually went to another country first, and that's where they applied. They get, selected by the UN and get given a refugee status, and that's kind of the first green light to move forward. And then you go through your series of interviews with USCIS. So I would say that was the first level of impact, that a lot of those offices just weren't given the resources to carry out interviews and carry out that processing as quickly as they should have. And then the next level is that even if you were approved, the refugee organizations here in the US kind of have to come together and decide where to place those families, depending on what community they come from and what kind of need they have, because the local community has to be able to address those levels of need. So I think in a way it's brought down, the numbers have come down not necessarily because of the announcements made in Texas. They've come down because of the numbers going down everywhere else. But to give you an idea, in 2015, Texas received around 7,000 refugees, and about 2,000 of those came to Houston. And then in 2019, there were about 3,700, and less than 1,000, or about 1,000 came to Houston. So I think that there's been a layer of impact of people coming here. And then the other thing that maybe people fail to consider is that once you're in the US, you can move, right? So even if we close our placement to refugees here in Texas, that doesn't mean that they can't go next door to Louisiana and then move to Houston. So it affects your immediate arrival, but in practice, it doesn't have that big of an impact.
Nice. And so seeing and knowing what you know, and I know that PAIR works a lot with youth and their families, refugee youth and their families, what infrastructures are in place to protect the health of these extremely vulnerable populations during this time in a pandemic, especially new arrivals who may be familiar but very unfamiliar with kind of the healthcare system, what is going on, how to get resources from there?
Yeah, and these are conversations I've been having with my students and their families, right? So how are you dealing with all of this? One of the things we've learned is there's a lot of misinformation out there. So there's just this push from the community at every layer of all the organizations that work with refugees to mobilize and get information out to people, and just basic things about what is this virus, how do you take care of yourself. Don't listen to these people that offer easy cures, because that's very popular in the media that they're consuming, and just kind of making that as accessible as possible in their languages for people who have literacy or no literacy. But it's very hard to reach some of these communities. And then there's also the element of protecting the people servicing refugees. So for a while, when refugees come here, right, there's a refugee agency that's in charge of case management for them, picks them up at the airport, gets them set up with Medicaid and Social Security and all the resources they need, have a bank account, and get your basic life going. But none of that can happen if all of us need to socially distance and be safe for each other. So I think that's been one of the difficult things. For the youth that we are working with in particular, I think school is the big one. education. When you close schools, you really close off a lot of other support resources to them. They rely on school, like a lot of other low-income communities, right, for food, for extracurricular activities, for after-school programs like PAIR, for connection, and English practice in particular, because they're usually only talking to each other in their own language. So I think it's been really hard to be in that place of isolation and not get the usual enriching activities that you need to grow. So there's been a lot of layers, and of course there's the usual people just come. It hasn't been as easy for them to find jobs or get started with English classes or other things that they would typically be doing. And yeah, from a health perspective, I was telling your colleagues earlier that these families live in very crowded apartments at times. So socially distancing is not an option. If one person gets sick, it's very easy for that virus to spread within that household.
Yeah. And not only, I think they're in a very interesting position, I think, with a lot of different families during this time, because you have this pandemic going on, but at the same time, you also have these very intense racial tension that's going on. So it's this duality and layer on top of layer that the students are having. And I know we had a previous conversation about what that has been for you all, for a lot of students where maybe before they never had to consider these things. So how has the latest kind of news around racial tensions affected refugees and their families' integration in the long-term manner?
Not easy, like they're saying. I think the group of students we're working with now, or this entire generation, is seeing one thing after another, right? Living with the pandemic and then living with the realization that the country, I think most people that come from the outside really look up to the US as this ideal of inclusivity and diversity. And when you get here and that's not the case, I think that's a shock. And I think one of the things that people may not realize too is that refugees are not a single uniform community, right? Within refugees, there are different races and different religions and different backgrounds, and there are already existing tensions that those communities bring with them. But when they get here, there's a whole intersection of identities, because adding to your identity as a Congolese refugee, now you are throwing in the mix of being a Black kid in the US, and that comes with a lot of other attack and prejudice and discrimination that maybe you were not anticipating when you came here. So I think that we've always seen community tensions and conflicts with our refugee students just that come with the label of being a refugee. So it's not unusual for my kids to talk about being bullied, and my refugee students' kids, to talk about being bullied and harassed because of what they look like, because of what they sound like, because they are visibly not from this country, whatever that means. And then adding to that, you have, if you are a Black refugee, your school police is constantly after you. And if you are a Muslim refugee, you may not be accepted because you're wearing a hijab and not let in on the school bus because people have certain feelings against you. So all of that is just really sad. And I think for better or worse, when refugees come, they're really in survival mode, right? So their immediate need, I must address this, I have to feed my family, I have to work, I have to survive in school. So they don't have the opportunity to immediately engage with a lot of these issues or even develop the critical thinking and civic engagement. But it's one of the things that we work hard on with our older students, especially because they do start to have these conversations and just these kind of eye-opening moments when they go off to college or when they start their first jobs, and they realize, oh yeah, so life is not as glossy as we thought it should be, and why are these things happening, right? Why does being Black here mean something very different than being Black in Uganda? So I think those are very interesting conversations that we're just starting to explore at PAIR as well. And then there's the other piece of that is that our students are subject to the same systemic issues that students of color born in America are, right? The fact that you live in an area that is high poverty means that you go to schools that are very under-resourced, means that you don't get the same educational opportunities and job opportunities as people that are of different racial or socioeconomic backgrounds. I don't know if that answered your question, but I'm really hoping all these protests and social justice initiatives will take into consideration the refugee population as well.
Yeah, I think it's opening up a lot of people's eyes to sit with questions, and also just to see how nuanced it is. And I think being a refugee or an immigrant, it adds another layer on top of something that you already had to deal with. And that's a lot for students to unpack, as well as trying to be, ambassadors and translators for their parents and for their family members. And so I think the work that you all are doing and just trying to help students kind of pick through what that means for them living here, while also trying to decide and see how that is for you as well with your family. And could you tell, I know you spoke a little bit about PAIR, so can you tell us about the work and how you're doing work with PAIR Houston, with the refugee youth and their families, and how you're helping to integrate the students during this time, since a lot of things are very virtual, so that has switched up how you interact with students?
Yeah, so PAIR has been around for about 14 years now, and we are a mentoring organization primarily. So we serve students in after-school programs with group mentoring, and then we also have a community-based one-on-one mentoring program for our students who are getting ready to finish high school and go on to college. So our approach to serving the refugee youth in Houston has always been to serve the holistic needs of students. So serving the student as a whole, not just offering this one-off like English class or tutorials, but really helping with their academics, with their language acquisition, and then beyond that, just social emotional skills and critical life skills and leadership, and getting them some exposure through field trips to life outside their daily routines. So I think that coming into this pandemic, we kind of took that same approach, right? So we're not just looking at, our students are going into online school, like school's going to be really hard, but first saying, hey, our school, there's this whole health crisis going on. Their parents may be losing their jobs. They may not have enough food. So let's go through addressing those immediate needs first. So we kind of just checked in on our students within those first few weeks after schools closed, to try to get a sense of what they were feeling, how they were doing, and what they needed, and then just went from there, right? If there were students that, I think the majority of the students just reported not being able to connect for school purposes. I think online education is very difficult, and our programs have always kind of been very successful because we're very high touch, right? We're in the lives of kids, we're in their homes, we're doing a lot of community outreach and know a lot about their lives. But that's very hard to do in a high tech world with students that have minimal English, that don't have technology, that don't have the devices, let alone reliable internet access. So I think that's been a new barrier for doing our work in the usual way. But I think it's also a great opportunity, and we've really been kind of focusing on helping students build those skills. First, of course, issuing them an actual device they can use to do their online schooling, but then just teaching them how to communicate and how to use those things for their learning. But yeah, our programs are still happening. They're just happening remotely. They're happening through Zoom and Google Hangouts and Instagram Live and other tools, same as your youth programs.
Yeah.
And trying to reach as many kids as possible that way. But we also realize that the virtual way doesn't work for everybody. So when possible, we do socially distanced visits, and we drop off actual supplies, or we just do like little check-ins with students from afar to make sure that they're doing fine, and bring them food and supplies and resources if they say that that's something that's missing in their families.
Okay. Thank you. And just one moment, I'm going to turn back on the lights that have went off in the room. Just give me one moment. Come on. Okay, thank you all for patience. And so we're taking some questions from the audience at this moment. So if you have any questions, please submit them at this time. So we have a question from Roman. He says, in particular, in light of the deep connections to Houston, could you talk in some more detail about the status of Venezuelan refugees in the U.S. and across Latin America?
Yeah, I think early on, as we started the conversation, I did mention that Venezuelans are right now one of the largest refugee groups in the world, but also one of the populations that have been coming as asylum seekers and under refugee status into the U.S. as well. And then that's also reflected. I forgot this part, but most of the refugees, when they flee their countries, I said that they don't come directly to the third resettlement countries, but they also go to neighboring countries that are also developing and oftentimes don't have the capacity to absorb large refugee populations. So right now, a lot of Venezuelans are going into Colombia. Colombia is seeing a rise in the refugee numbers as well. And then there are, of course, the Venezuelans coming here. So I think that they're a special category, but the largest numbers of people in the U.S. or in Houston, at least, and in Houston, I would say, are Congolese from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that's because it takes a long time to process cases under our resettlement process. So you won't see the trends of a high number of Venezuelans coming right away, because those are still being determined from Venezuela or Colombia, or wherever they're applying for refugee status at first. But I agree. I think they're facing that piece of persecution that's more based on politics and belonging to social groups that are not accepted by the larger Venezuelan society. And I have a lot of Venezuelan friends that I think are just facing just even from a distance, whether you're here, whether you have family over there, trying to figure out how this happened and how the country got to where it is now. So I'm hoping that we'll see more Venezuelans get refugee status. I don't know what that will look like with COVID and all our other arrival numbers, but at least in Houston, they are coming in decent numbers.
Thank you. And we have another question submitted from Aileen. How do you talk to refugee kids about issues such as mental health when it's something not talked about that may or may not be talked about in their cultures?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges for refugees coming here is a lot of unaddressed trauma. So it's not directly talked about, but it manifests itself in different ways. And we see it with the kids who can't concentrate in class, or the kids who just have kind of different types of ways to express a lot of anger and frustration and sadness that they come with. We do try to introduce students as they get older and they're able to make more decisions for themselves, right? And I see this with my students going off to college who start having a lot of challenges fitting in and belonging and having that kind of re-trauma of what they went through when they first moved here. But I think, as the question said, it's not really common for these cultures to have the ideal of mental health and talking to a stranger about your issues, right? Like, this is something you're facing, it's something you should deal with, and there's not a lot of drive from the individuals themselves to seek that help out. It will usually come from community referrals or from the schools that are like, hey, you should really talk to someone, you should really talk to this counselor, and are able to address things that way. I think it's a need that the refugee community has. I think with kids it's even harder, because it's harder for them to get to open up, and then it's hard for them to get for the schools and counselors to get the parents and the families on board and get their approval for them to get those services. But I think it's one of those things that if you are not addressing directly, you have to navigate carefully, right? So at PAIR, I think we're always really aware of not bringing in triggers or anything that will kind of bring out those mental health issues for our kids, and just making it as safe a place as possible, and make them feel like they can be comfortable there, and they don't have to stress about anything else going on from their past, because they have faced very horrific things, and they've seen conflicts, they've seen people die around them, and they've lost family members, and they're going through a lot. So stress is a big piece of it, and I see it as our students leave our programs and have to face adulthood. It kind of starts coming back to them.
Yeah. Thank you. And a question was submitted from Susan. Hypothetically, what would you expect to change under a Biden presidency around refugees and immigration?
A very good question. I would say for refugees specifically, I'm hoping there will be a bouncing back to our typical admission numbers. So if we are at our lowest since September 11th right now at 18,000 or around those areas, that we can increase that cap to allow more people in. And again, these are people that are refugees that are very carefully vetted for long periods of time. It would just be a matter of saying, yes, we're willing to accept more and taking some of that responsibility and just bringing them back into the resettlement program. I think the issue with asylum seekers at the border is a bit more complex, but I hope that those people at least get an opportunity to have their cases heard, because I think that's where the problem is starting. In the past, our asylum process, you could come in and wait until you had a hearing or until an officer reviewed your case. Right now, we're making people wait at the border in Mexico, where they also don't have the ability to continue their lives. So I think that one of those challenges is these people are outside of our country, they don't have legal representation, and they have very little opportunity to even be able to request a protection that should be available to them. So I'm hoping some of those things would go back to the normal before the Trump administration. Of course, in the immediate future, the health pandemic and the crisis is kind of just out of necessity, right? We have to maybe be more careful with our borders and who's coming in. But I think overall, if that is not a threat, people should be allowed to continue to come under our usual laws.
Thank you. And we had another question submitted from William. He says, what countries are currently off the list of countries the U.S. will accept refugees from? So are there any particular countries that are not?
Yes, our anti-Muslim ban is still in place, in effect. So as you know, the people that are coming to the U.S., you won't see, Syria, even though it's the largest source country of refugees, you won't see that reflected in the refugee arrivals here in the U.S., right? You won't see places like Somalia or other places that had typically been sending a lot of refugees here because, again, travel ban. The only exception for that are the Iraqi and Afghani refugees that come under special immigrant status because they helped during the wars on the U.S. side. So I think those are kind of small exceptions to that. But yeah, and it's the thing that's changing constantly. We don't know what, the leadership of our nation is going to say the next day and say, hey, we're imposing this ban on another country for XYZ reasons. So I think it's one of those things where you just have to keep an eye on the news, and it's usually the people most affected in those countries that will realize, right, they're not allowed under very unfair guidelines, because that's not written anywhere that you can just leave people out based on country of origin.
I think everyone will be holding their breaths until the next time to see just kind of what's going to happen and how that will play itself out. However, in the meantime, we have a question from Mariel, who's asked, what would be the best way to get involved and support ongoing efforts around refugees?
Yeah, I love that question. I have 3 things that people listening in can do. The first is getting informed and educated. I think the World Affairs Council is a really great platform that's already offering that. So continue to participate in these discussions and, read things that have a lot of nuance to it, because none of these issues are simple or have a simple solution to them. So definitely get informed, but don't just stop at learning. The second thing is to actually do something about it. So if you are in a place where you have time to volunteer, I think one of the things that can be most powerful in changing people's misconceptions about refugees is actually getting to know them and getting to see that they're really incredible people with just kindness and that value the same things that you do. So if you want to mentor a refugee, if you want to join some of our refugee organizations that welcome refugees and be a part of that, definitely find those volunteer opportunities. At PAIR, of course, we always need help in terms of guiding and supporting our youth. So if that's something that's interesting to you, go to our website, sign up to be a volunteer. If you are in a position to give financially, I think that a lot of organizations and nonprofits are hurting right now, and they really need funds to continue their work, and a lot of people and clients that are counting on that. And I would say always pick an issue or a cause that you really care about and give to that, whatever you can give, whether it's money or time or your talent. So I talked a little bit about law earlier. If you are more interested in that and about the asylum seekers and what's happening at the borders, the Houston Immigration Legal Services Collaborative, it's a long name, but they can connect you with a lot of people doing some of that work on the ground, and get more informed about those particular problems. And then refugees, we have a lot of refugee organizations, but you can always contact us if you want to be connected to them or to work directly with PAIR. And then the final one, if you are a politically inclined person, use your voice and help raise the voice of other people. I think that voting is going to be really, really important this year, but also contact your representatives and teach them a little bit about what you learned today. Just change a lot of those ideas that people have of who refugees are and what they're here for. And if you don't know where to start, Refugee Council USA has some tips on how to contact and what to say. So I think definitely just don't sit back and wait for things to happen, because I think, Felicia, we talked about how one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation is that COVID's taken over everything else, right? And we're so saturated with that news for very valid reasons, but there are a lot of other things and a lot of other people that still need help in other ways. And I think those issues also kind of have to get some attention. So,
thank you. And we had a question submitted from, my apologies, Ipiling Motuba, who asked, how can legal practitioners advocate for those who fear persecution based on the grounds of sexual and gender-based violence? And how will they find their place / eligibility for refugee status?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It was actually one of the things I worked on back when I did legal work. A lot of my cases were asylum seekers for gender-based violence cases, and just domestic violence and other victims of crimes. But so I think they were asking from the legal practitioner side what you can do to help. Is that correct?
Yes, from the legal side.
Yeah, the Tahirih Justice Center, that's their sole focus. It's gender-based violence and serving people that want to have protection under those grounds. So it would be a good place for connection. And I know they always welcome pro bono help. So I think that would be a good place to look at, as well as the YMCA International Services. They do some of those similar asylum cases, and that's where I worked in the past. So I think that there are people that are definitely focusing on that work, and serving those clients. And I think it's a very crucial issue, because there's no clarity, as I mentioned, under our asylum and refugee laws. So you really need somebody who's very good at presenting those cases, and helping you gain that protection. So if you are in a position to donate and volunteer as a legal professional, please go to those organizations and do some pro bono work.
Thank you so much, Mariel, for those answers and questions, and just for your time. And before we go, I wanted to ask, how can people watching this webinar get involved or learn more about PAIR's work? So how can they contact you?
Yeah, so first go to our website, PAIR Houston, and if you have just inquiries about signing up for our newsletter, knowing about our general work, or you just want more information about volunteering, we have an email that is pair@pairhouston.org. If you have questions for me specifically, you can use my first name at pairhouston.org, but I would generally advise you to go to our general website and really learn more about our work, and I think it's there in our chat. Thank you. And yeah, reach out to us if you are interested in learning more about what we're doing. We're just working with kids and youth in middle school and high school.
So thank you so much, Mariel, just for your time and for all of the work that you've put in over the years around immigration and refugees. We are so grateful to have a partner like you with the World Affairs Council. And so, again, thank you to everyone who took the time out to join us this evening talking about refugees in America. I hope that this has made you think, it's made you want to tell a friend of how you can get involved in the city and globally in the global community. So thank you. I hope that you join us next week for our upcoming webinars. Also, stay tuned with more student programming for middle school and high schools. And I hope to see you all very, very soon. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you next week as we host Robert Reich, the former Secretary of Labor. Thank you.